I've always been a dog person. Growing up, we had a golden retriever named Max who was more like a sibling than a pet. When I moved out of my parents' house, I knew I wanted a dog to keep me company. After months of searching, I found a rescue shelter that had a striking black shepherd mix named Shadow. His piercing yellow eyes had an intensity that seemed almost human. From the moment I brought Shadow home, something felt off. At first, I chalked it up to him adjusting to his new surroundings. He was quiet, almost too quiet for a dog his size. He never barked, never whimpered. Even when I left him alone during the day, my neighbors told me they never heard a sound. But it wasn't just his silence that unnerved me. It was the way he watched me. Those yellow eyes followed my every move, unblinking and cold, as if he were studying me, waiting for something. The first real sign that something was wrong happened a week after I brought him home. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching. My bedroom door was shut, but the noise was coming from the other side. Groggy, I got up and opened the door, expecting to see Shadow. Instead, I found nothing. No dog, no scratches on the door. Confused, I checked the living room where he usually slept, but he wasn't there. I finally found him sitting in the dark kitchen, staring at the back door. His posture was rigid, his ears alert. When I called his name, he didn't react, not even a flicker of recognition. It was as if he was in some kind of trance. The next morning, I discovered deep claw marks on the back door. The strange thing was, they weren't on the inside where Shadow could have made them. They were on the outside, as if something had been trying to get in. As the days went on, Shadow's behavior grew more bizarre. He started disappearing at night. I'd find him in strange places. The attic, the basement, even locked rooms where I had no idea how he got in. Once, I woke up to find him sitting at the foot of my bed, staring at me with those unblinking yellow eyes. His breath was cold, unnaturally cold like a winter wind. Then came the dreams. They started as flashes of Shadow's face, distorted and snarling, his eyes glowing in the darkness. But soon the dreams became more vivid. I saw myself walking through endless corridors, Shadow always behind me, his footsteps silent but ever present. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the faint sound of growling echoing in my ears. The worst night happened 2 months after I adopted him. I was sitting on the couch watching TV when the power suddenly cut out. The apartment was plunged into darkness. I grabbed my phone for light and called out for Shadow. No response. My heart raced as I searched the rooms, but he was nowhere to be found. That's when I heard it. A low guttural growl coming from the basement. I didn't even know he could growl. Against my better judgment, I descended the creaking stairs, the light from my phone barely piercing the pitch black. The growling grew louder, more menacing. When I reached the bottom, I saw him. Shadow was standing in the middle of the basement, his body tense, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. But he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the corner of the room. "Shadow?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He growled again, louder this time, his teeth bared. I turned my phone's light toward the corner, and my blood ran cold. The shadows there seemed to ripple, shifting unnaturally, as if something was trying to take shape. And then I saw them. 2 glinting eyes staring back at me, eyes that weren't human or animal. They were wrong, alien, malevolent. Suddenly, Shadow lunged at the darkness, barking for the first time since I'd known him. His body collided with the shadows, and the room erupted into chaos. Growls, snarls, and a high-pitched screech filled the air. I stumbled backward, dropping my phone. In the dim light, I could see Shadow thrashing, biting at something I couldn't fully see. Then, silence. When I finally found the courage to pick up my phone and shine the light again, the corner was empty. Shadow was lying on the floor, his chest heaving. His yellow eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw fear in them. Real, unmistakable fear. That night I slept with every light in the apartment on, Shadow curled up at my feet. The next morning I called the shelter, demanding to know where Shadow had come from. After some hesitation, the woman on the phone admitted that he had been found abandoned near an old farmhouse. Locals claimed the place was cursed, that strange things happened there, but no one ever stayed long enough to find out for sure. I still have Shadow. He's different now, quieter, more subdued. Whatever happened that night in the basement took something out of him. And me. I don't dream anymore, at least not that I can remember. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear scratching at the back door. And I know, deep down, that it's not over. Not yet. I've always been a dog person. Growing up, I had a Labrador named Max who was my best friend. After Max passed away, I couldn't bring myself to get another dog for years. The pain of losing him was too much. But when I finally decided it was time, I found myself scrolling through rescue websites late one night. That's when I saw him, a lean black dog with piercing amber eyes staring straight into the camera. His name was Shadow. The rescue center's description was vague. Shadow is a loyal companion, but requires an experienced owner. There was no mention of his breed, his history, or why he had been surrendered. Something about his eyes, though, drew me in. They seemed human. Without thinking twice, I filled out the adoption form. When I arrived at the center, the staff seemed eager to get Shadow off their hands. The handler who brought him out avoided my gaze and hurriedly handed me the leash. Shadow stood quietly by my side, his gaze fixed on me as if he already knew me. "Any advice?" I asked the handler. She hesitated, then muttered, "Just don't leave him alone at night." I laughed nervously, thinking it was some odd joke, but her expression remained grave. Shadow adjusted to my home quickly. He was calm, obedient, and eerily intelligent. I'd never had to teach him anything. It was as if he already knew my commands before I spoke them. But strange things started happening almost immediately. The first night, I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint, like nails dragging against wood. Groggy, I stumbled out of bed and found Shadow sitting in the living room, staring at the front door. His ears were pricked, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" I whispered. He didn't move, didn't even blink. His gaze was fixed on the door as if something was on the other side. I opened it to check, but the street was empty. Still, Shadow remained by the door all night, refusing to budge. The following nights were worse. Shadow began to growl at nothing. He'd stare into corners of the house, his hackles raised, his teeth bared. Once I caught him snarling at his own reflection in the mirror. But it wasn't just a snarl, it was a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. His reflection seemed wrong. The way it moved wasn't in sync with him, like it was lagging behind. Then came the whispers. I'd hear them late at night, faint and indistinct, as if someone were murmuring just out of earshot. At first I thought it was the wind or the hum of the refrigerator, but one night, as I lay in bed, I realized the whispers were coming from inside the room. I turned on the light, and there was Shadow, sitting at the foot of my bed, staring at me with those unblinking amber eyes. His mouth was slightly open, and for a horrifying moment, I thought the whispers were coming from him. I started to avoid looking into his eyes. There was something about them that felt invasive, like they could see straight into my soul. Shadow's behavior grew more erratic. He'd vanish for hours, only to reappear in rooms I was sure I'd closed off. He stopped eating his food, instead staring at it as if waiting for it to move. Once, I woke up to find him sitting on my chest, staring down at me, his breath hot against my face. His weight was crushing, and it took everything in me to shove him off. The final straw came 3 weeks after I adopted him. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a low growl. My bedroom door was ajar, and Shadow was standing in the hallway, his body silhouetted by the faint glow of the nightlight. His eyes glowed unnaturally in the dark. As I stared at him, frozen, he began to move toward me, his growl growing louder. I reached for my phone, but it wasn't on the nightstand. Shadow was in the room now, his growl a deafening rumble that vibrated in my chest. He stopped at the foot of the bed and stood there, staring at me. Then, in a voice that wasn't mine, I heard him speak. "Leave." I scrambled out of bed, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Shadow didn't move, didn't chase me as I fled the house. I spent the night in my car, parked a few blocks away, trying to convince myself I was losing my mind. The next morning I returned home to find Shadow gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. No fur, no paw prints, nothing. It was as if he'd never been there. But the house felt different. Colder, emptier. I tried calling the rescue center, but the number was disconnected. When I drove there, the building was abandoned, the windows boarded up. It's been months now, but I still feel like I'm being watched. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers and the sound of scratching at my door. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see those amber eyes staring back at me. For as long as I can remember, I've been a dog person. My childhood was spent running through fields with Rusty, our old golden retriever, at my side. When I moved out, I adopted Bruno, a German shepherd with an unbreakable loyalty and a sharp mind. But I'm not here to tell you about those happy memories. I'm here to tell you about Max, the dog that almost cost me my life. Max wasn't your ordinary dog. I found him on a cold November night, trembling by a dumpster behind the bar where I worked. His fur was matted and filthy, his ribs visible under his patchy coat. He looked up at me with these piercing yellow eyes, and something in me just couldn't leave him there. I brought him home, cleaned him up, and gave him a bowl of leftover stew. He devoured it like he hadn't eaten in weeks. From the moment Max entered my life, things began to shift. At first it was little things. I'd hear scratching at the back door, only to find Max sitting in the living room, his head tilted as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. Or I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him staring at the corner of my bedroom, growling low and steady. I chalked it up to him adjusting to a new environment. Maybe he'd been abused or neglected. It wasn't until the first incident that I started to doubt my rationalizations. It was a Friday night, and I'd just finished watching a movie. Max was lying on the floor by the couch, his eyes half closed. Suddenly he bolted upright, his ears perked. He stared at the front door, his growl building into a ferocious snarl. Before I could react, he lunged at the door, barking wildly. I grabbed a flashlight and peered outside, but the street was empty. No wind, no movement, nothing. When I turned back, Max was still by the door, but his eyes, they didn't look like a dog's eyes anymore. They were too human, too knowing. I shook it off, blaming my overactive imagination and the shadows from the flashlight. But the incidents kept happening. Max would vanish for hours, only to reappear as if he'd been there all along. Sometimes I'd wake up to find him standing on my bed staring down at me, his breath hot and rancid. I started to lock my bedroom door at night, but it didn't help. I'd wake to the sound of scratching, a slow, deliberate scrape that seemed to come from inside the walls. One night, I decided to install cameras around the house. I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. What I saw chilled me to the core. At 3:17 a.m., Max was in the kitchen staring at the ceiling. Then, without warning, he stood on his hind legs. Not like a dog begging for a treat. He stood upright, his posture eerily human. He walked out of frame, but not on 4 legs. On 2. I couldn't believe what I'd seen. I replayed the footage over and over, hoping it was some kind of glitch. But it wasn't. That night I locked every door and window, armed myself with a baseball bat and waited. Max was nowhere to be seen. Around midnight, the power went out. My house plunged into darkness, the only sound the faint hum of the wind outside. I lit a candle and sat in the living room, my grip on the bat tightening with every creak of the floorboards. Then I heard it, a low growl, coming from the hallway. "Max?" I called out, my voice trembling. The growl grew louder, more guttural. I held up the candle, its flickering light casting twisted shadows on the walls. And then I saw him. Max stood at the end of the hallway, his yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. But it wasn't just Max. His body was twisted, his limbs unnaturally long, his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that revealed far too many teeth. "What the hell are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He tilted his head, that horrible grin widening. Then he spoke. Not a bark, not a growl. Words. You brought me here. You let me in. I don't remember much after that. I think I screamed. I swung the bat, but it went right through him like he wasn't entirely solid. The next thing I knew, I was running. Out the front door, into the freezing night, barefoot and terrified. I never went back to that house. I reported Max to animal control, but they found no trace of him. No fur, no footprints, nothing. It was as if he or whatever he was had never existed. To this day, I can't look at a dog without feeling a cold knot of fear in my stomach. They say dogs are man's best friend, but I learned the hard way that some dogs, some things, should never be invited into your home.